Her name was Ren Callaway, and for 11 years she had been the kind of woman who did not stop, not for hitchhikers, not for stalled cars, not for the ragged edges of other people's disasters, because stopping was how you got hurt, and Ren had learned to keep her hands on the wheel and her eyes on the white line. But on a black night in the mountains above Cedar Hollow, in a storm that came down off the ridge like something with an appetite, she stopped for a shape in the ditch that turned out to be a man barely alive, and a whisper in the dark that would not leave her. And by the time the truth of that whisper had finished with her, she would understand that the thing she had pulled out of the floodwater was not the only thing being rescued that night. This is the story of how a woman who had trained herself to feel nothing learned again to feel everything, and what she uncovered doing it. The rain had started 3 hours out of the valley, and by the time Ren crested the pass, it was no longer rain so much as a moving wall, a thing that hammered the roof of the old Bronco and turned the headlights into 2 weak yellow smears against a world gone to water. She drove with both hands, 40 miles an hour where she would normally do 60, the wipers losing the fight. And she talked to herself the way she always did, on the long hauls, low and even, the sound of her own voice a fence around the loneliness. She was 41 years old, and she was going home to a house that no longer had anyone in it, and she was in no hurry to get there. That was the private arithmetic of her life. Nothing waiting, so no reason to rush, so drive slow and let the storm decide. She had a thermos of bad gas station, coffee wedged against her hip, gone cold an hour ago, and she took a sip of it out of stubbornness rather than thirst. Ahead the road bent left along the shoulder of the mountain, and below the bent the land fell away into timber, and the long dark throat of the creek. Swollen now, she could hear it even over the storm, a low continuous roar like a train that never arrived. She almost did not see him. That was the thing she would come back to later, in the small hours when sleep would not come. She almost drove past. The headlights caught something pale in the ditch on the downhill side, a smear of lighter dark against the running black, and every trained instinct she owned said, "Keep going," said that a shape in a ditch at midnight in a killing storm was a trap or a corpse or a stranger's grief that would become her own if she let it. Her foot did not lift from the gas. And then the shape moved, just barely. A hand, she thought, or the ghost of a hand, lifting an inch out of the water and falling back, and something in Ren that she had bricked over years ago and mortared shut cracked along an old seam. And before she had decided anything, her foot was on the brake and the Bronco was slewing sideways on the flooded road and coming to rest half on the shoulder with the engine ticking and the wipers still slapping and her heart going like a fist against a door. She sat for 1 full second. She counted it, the way she counted everything. 1. Then she was out into the rain, and the cold took her breath the way cold water does, all at once driving the air out of her lungs, and she was down the slick grass of the embankment, with her boots sliding, going toward the pale shape that the creek was trying to take. It was a man. He was face up, thank God, wedged against a fallen branch that had snagged him out of the current, and the water was over his legs and rising, and his skin in the headlight glow was the gray-white of something that had already given up. She got her hands under his arms. He was heavy, deadweight heavy, and the mud sucked at her boots, and the branch that held him was already working loose in the flood, and she thought, with a strange flat clarity, if I do not move him in the next minute, the creek will take us both. She moved him. She would never afterward be able to say exactly how, only that her body remembered how to do hard things, even when her mind had gone quiet with panic, and that she dug her heels into the bank and hauled, screaming with the effort in a way she was glad no one could hear, until the two of them were up out of the water and lying in the grass in the rain, and she could get her ear down to his mouth. And that was when she heard it. Not from him. From herself, almost, a voice she did not recognize as her own, saying, "Please, please," a word she had not used in years, and then, under it, so faint she thought she imagined it, a whisper from the gray lips of the man she had pulled from the flood. 2 words, cracked and wet and barely there. He's still breathing. She jerked back. For one wild instant, she thought he meant himself, some fever logic of the dying. And then his eyes came open, pale eyes unfocused, swimming up out of a great depth, and they found her face, and his hand rose again, the hand she had seen from the road, and it closed around her wrist with a strength that shocked her. "He's still breathing," he said again, clearer now, and there was a terrible urgency in it. And Ren said, "Who? Who's still breathing?" And the man's eyes rolled toward the timber, toward the black wall of trees below the road where the creek roared, and he said a third word before the light in him guttered down again. "Down there." Ren Callaway had spent 11 years not stopping. She had built a whole life out of not stopping. And it had kept her safe. And it had kept her alone. Which she had told herself for so long were the same thing that she had forgotten they were not. And now she knelt in the freezing mud with a stranger's hand locked around her wrist and his ruined whisper in her ears, and she looked down the mountain into the dark, where he said something else was still breathing, and she felt the whole architecture of her carefulness begin to come apart. Because there was a question in front of her now, and it was the oldest question, and there was no way to keep driving past it. Somewhere down in that timber, in that rising water, something was alive and drowning. And she was the only one who had stopped. She got her phone out with numb fingers, and of course there was no signal. There was never any signal up here. That was half the reason people came to these mountains and half the reason people died in them. She had a decision tree in her head, the way she always did, cold and quick. The man was breathing but going into shock. She had a truck, blankets, a first aid kit that was better than most because Ren did not do anything by halves. She could load him and drive for the valley and the little clinic in Cedar Hollow, 20 minutes down the pass, and she could save this one life. And she could tell herself that she had done the thing. She had stopped, she had helped, and whatever else was down in that black timber was not her problem, and never had been. That was the reasonable choice. That was the choice the old Ren would have made without even feeling the other one pulling at her. But she felt it now. She felt it the way you feel. "A hook set deep down there," he had said. "He's still breathing." And she understood, kneeling in the mud, that if she drove away and later learned that something living had died in that water, while she chose the safe road, she would carry it. She would add it to the freight she already carried. And she was so tired of carrying things. So, she did a thing that made no sense by any accounting she had ever kept. She dragged the man the rest of the way up the bank, which took everything she had, and she got him into the back of the Bronco and wrapped him in the wool blankets and the emergency bag's mylar sheet, and she jammed the cold thermos into his hands, more for the comfort of the gesture than any use, and she left the heater roaring and the dome light on. And then she took her flashlight and she went back down the embankment, into the dark, toward the water, toward the thing that was still breathing. And she thought, "God help me. I am doing the one thing I swore I would never do." The timber closed over her like a roof. Under the trees, the rain came down in fat, delayed drops off the branches, and the roar of the creek was everything, and her flashlight beam bored a narrow cone into a chaos of running water and floating debris and slick black trunks. She went down carefully, testing each step, because the last thing anyone needed was 2 people in the creek. And she called out, "Hello! Hello! Is anyone there?" and heard nothing but the water. She swung the beam along the bank. Branches. A wedge of pale foam. A dark hummock that might have been a stump. And then, at the very edge of the light, something that was not a stump, because it moved, a small heaving movement, and made a sound that cut through the roar of the creek and went straight into the oldest part of Ren's brain, the part that predated language, the part that knew the sound of a creature in extremity. Not human. She realized that in the same instant, not a person down there in the water, but alive and drowning, and a man on the road had spent what might have been his last conscious breath begging her to save it. She went to it. The bank fell away steeply, and she went down on her backside sliding, the flashlight clamped in her teeth, now, both hands out, and she came up against the thing in the shallows where the flood had pinned it against a lattice of fallen branches. It was a dog, a big dog, dark, its coat plastered flat, and it was tangled in something. That was the thing. It was not simply caught in the current. There was a rope, a thin nylon cord bitten deep into the flesh of one hind leg, and the other end of the cord was tied. She saw this, and her stomach turned over. The other end was tied to a cinder block. Half sunk in the mud, and the water was rising, and the dog's head was going under, and coming up, and going under. And it had almost no fight left. Someone had done this. Someone had tied a living animal to a weight and put it in a creek to drown. And the man on the road had seen it, or done it, or tried to stop it. And Ren did not have time to sort out which, because the water was at the dog's chin and rising. She had a knife. She always had a knife. She got it out, and she got her arm around the dog's chest, and the animal, half mad with terror and cold, twisted and snapped at her, its teeth grazing her jacket, and she said, in a low, steady voice, the same thing she had said to frighten things her whole life. "Easy, easy. I've got you, I'm not going to leave you." And something in the tone, or the words, or the sheer stubbornness of her reached down through the dog's panic, and it went still against her shaking, its heart slamming under her forearm. She got the blade against the cord, and she sawed, and the nylon was tough and wet and slick, and her hands were shaking with cold, and the water rose over her own thighs where she knelt in the creek, and she sawed and cursed and prayed in a jumble. And then the cord parted, and she had the whole trembling weight of the dog in her arms, and she was hauling it up the bank away from the water that had wanted them both. She got it into the trees and collapsed there, the dog across her lap, the flashlight fallen, and pointing uselessly into the leaves. And she put her hand flat against its ribs, and felt, under the shaking, under the terrible cold, the fast fluttering insistence of a heartbeat that had refused to stop. It was breathing. It was still breathing. She started to laugh, and the laugh turned into something else, into a sob that came up out of her from a place she had kept locked for 11 years. And she sat in the wet dark with a stranger's dog in her arms, and cried the way she had not let herself cry since the last time she lost someone she was supposed to protect. The dog turned its head and, incredibly, in the middle of its own dying terror, it licked the salt off her cheek once, a rough, warm tongue in all that cold, and Ren understood in that moment, though she could not have put it into words, that she had climbed down into the dark to save a life, and something had reached back up and taken hold of hers. She could not stay. The man in the truck was dying, and the dog needed warmth, and the water was still rising. She gathered the animal against her chest. It was heavier than it should have been, and lighter than she feared. A big-boned dog, gone gaunt, its ribs a washboard under her hands, and she understood that it had been starving long before someone tried to drown it, and she carried it up the embankment, slipping, going down once on one knee, until she reached the Bronco with its dome light burning like a small yellow room hung in the storm. She got the tailgate open. The man was still breathing, too shallow and fast, and his eyes fluttered when the cold air hit him, and Ren laid the dog down beside him in the nest of blankets, and the animal, with the unerring instinct of its kind, pressed itself against the man's side, and the man's hand came up out of the mylar and found the wet fur and rested there. And something crossed his gray face that Ren could only call relief. "You found her," he whispered. "Whoa!" Ren said, "Is that her name?" And the man's mouth moved and no sound came. And then he said, "Juno," and passed out cold with his hand buried in the dog's ruff. Ren stood in the rain a moment longer, one hand on the tailgate, looking at the two of them, the drowning man and the drowning dog, side by side and breathing, and she felt the ground of her careful life shift under her like the flooded bank. She had stopped. Against every rule she had stopped. And now there was no unstopping it. She closed the tailgate gently, as though there were something in there that might break, and she got behind the wheel, and pointed the Bronco down the pass toward Cedar Hollow, driving into the rain with a stranger's life and a starving dog at the back, and 2 words going around in her head like a wheel that would not stop turning. Still breathing. Still breathing. She did not yet know whose cruelty she had stumbled into, or how far up the clean, bright ladder of Cedar Hollow's good and respectable people it would reach, or that the cinder block and the cord were the loose thread of something that would take everything she had to unravel. She only knew that the man had whispered, and she had been the only one who stopped, and that some doors, once opened, do not close again. The clinic in Cedar Hollow was a low brick building on the town's one long street, dark at this hour, except for a single light over the side door. And Ren stood on the wet stoop and leaned on the buzzer until a light came on inside and a shape resolved behind the frosted glass. The woman who opened the door was maybe 50, gray hair pulled back hard, reading glasses pushed up onto her forehead, a mug of tea in one hand, and an expression that said she had been woken up before and had learned to do it without wasting words. "This better be an emergency," she said, and then she saw Ren's face, and the mud, and the blood on her jacket that was mostly the dog's. And she set the mug down on a shelf without looking at it. "What have you got?" Ren said, "A man hypothermia shock. I pulled him out of the creek, up on the pass, and a dog. Somebody tied her to a block and put her in the water, and the woman's face did something complicated and hard, and she said, 'Bring them in, both of them, come on, move,' and held the door. Her name, Ren learned in the next hour, was Dr. Sten. Mabel Ochoa, and she ran the clinic mostly alone since the county cut the funding, and she was the closest thing Cedar Hollow had to a doctor for people, and in a pinch for animals, because you learned to be everything when you were the only one for 40 miles. She worked fast and she worked mean, the good way. The way of someone who has decided the universe does not get to take this one. And she got the man onto a table under warming lights with an IV in his arm and a monitor beeping his heart back toward something like a rhythm. And while she worked, she talked. A low-running commentary that Ren realized was as much for her own steadiness as anything. "Blunt trauma to the back of the head," Mabel said, feeling along the man's skull with gloved fingers. "He didn't get this from the water. Somebody hit him, and these," she turned his forearm, "these are defensive. He fought somebody, and he lost, and they left him in the creek to finish the job the same way they were finishing the dog." She looked up at Ren over the reading glasses. "You know who he is?" Ren shook her head. Mabel looked back down at the gray face. "I do," she said quietly. "That's Eli Brandt. He used to work security out at the Harrow place." And then she said a thing Ren did not understand yet, but would come to understand very well. "He's been telling anybody who'd listen that something's wrong out there, and nobody would listen." While Mabel stabilized the man, Ren sat on the clinic floor with the dog. Juno, wrapped in a fresh dry blanket, working warmth back into the animal with her hands and her voice, and she got her first real look at what had been done. The cord had cut to the bone above the hock, an ugly, weeping wound, and there were older marks under the matted fur, healed and half-healed, the geography of a body that had been used hard and fed little. But it was the ear that stopped Ren's breath. Someone had put a tattoo inside the dog's ear, a line of numbers and a small stylized mark, and clipped to the loose skin of the neck under all that dirty fur was a thin metal tag, not a collar tag. Something more like a livestock tag, stamped with the same numbers and a single word. Harrow. Ren turned the little tag in her fingers under the light, and Mabel, glancing over from the man on the table, went very still. "Where did you get that?" she said. Ren held it up. It was on the dog. Mabel came across the room, wiping her hands, and took the tag, and looked at it for a long moment. And when she spoke, her voice had gone flat and careful, in a way that made the hair stand up on Ren's arms. "Silas Harrow," he said, "runs the sanctuary out past the reservoir. The Harrow Refuge. Rescues animals nobody else will take. Give the sad speeches at the county fundraiser, gets his picture in the paper with a puppy every Christmas. She set the tag down on the counter as if it might bite her. Everybody in this valley loves Silas Harrow. And she looked at the wounded dog and the beaten man and the number stamped on the metal. And she said the thing that turned Ren's cold night into something colder. Then explained to me why one of his rescues just came out of the creek, tied to a cinder block. They did not sleep. Mabel put a cot in the back for the man, Eli, who drifted in and out, and once grabbed Ren's hand and said, "Don't take her back there, don't let them take her back," and then sank away again before Ren could ask what he meant. And Ren sat up through the last black hours of the storm, with the dog's head on her knee and the little metal tag on the counter catching the light, and she felt the old careful life she had driven down that mountain was sliding away from her for good. She had a grounding habit, a thing she did when the ground got unsteady under her, a way of naming 3 true things to hold herself in the present, and she used it now, sitting on the floor of a stranger's clinic at the bottom of a drowned night, the warm weight of the dog against her leg, the smell of wet fur and antiseptic, and the burnt coffee she had never finished. Mabel's low voice in the next room talking the injured man toward morning. 3 true things. She was here. She had stopped. And whatever was out at the Harrow Refuge, whatever a beloved man was doing to the creatures he stood up at fundraisers and swore to protect, she was going to find it. Because she had climbed down into the dark once tonight already and found that the darkest places were exactly the ones no one wanted to look at, and she was done. She was finally and completely done with driving past. Morning came gray and washed and dripping. The storm blown out over the far ridges, and Cedar Hollow steamed in a thin sun. Ellie Brent woke a little after 9, weak and hollow-eyed, but lucid, and over the course of a difficult hour, in a voice that kept giving out, he told them enough to break the last of Ren's disbelief. He had worked for Silas Harrow for 2 years, security and grounds, and at first the refuge had been what it claimed to be, a place for the broken and unwanted animals of 3 counties. But somewhere along the line, the money had gotten strange. Harrow took in animals with a great show of mercy, Eli said, and he collected the donations and the grants and the tearful checks from good people at the fundraisers. And then quietly, the animals that were supposed to be finding forever homes were disappearing off the books. Some of them, he said, and here his voice broke and Mabel had to make him drink, some of them were being sold on to worse places, to men who ran dogs, to people who bought a healthy animal cheap and used it up. And the ones too sick or too old or too damaged to sell, the ones that would have cost money to care for and were worth nothing on the wrong end of Silas Harrow's business. Those ones, Eli said, staring at the wall. Those ones went to the creek, with a block and a cord where they would never be found, because the creek took everything down to the reservoir, and the reservoir kept its secrets. I saw him do it, Eli said. 2 nights ago. I'd suspected for months. I'd been trying to get somebody to look. But Silas is Silas. He coaches the youth league, and he gave the new roof to the church. And who's going to believe the drunk he fired for making trouble? He'd made sure everybody thought I was the problem. Ren said, "Is that what he told people?" And Eli laughed. A terrible wet sound. "He's smart," he said. "He never raises his voice. He shakes your hand and washes it after." 2 nights ago, I followed him out to the creek in the dark, and I saw him put a dog in the water, and I got there too late for that one. And last night, I went back with a phone to get it on video, and he was there again, with Juno, and he caught me. His man Dodd caught me, and he touched the back of his own head and winced, and they put me in the creek too, right behind the dog, to make it look like I fell in drunk. His pale eyes found Ren's, but she got loose, he said. The dog. I don't know how, the cord must have been fraying. And she went downstream and I went after her. I don't even know why. I was half dead, and that's the last I remember. Until you. He looked at her the way a drowning man looks at the thing that pulled him out. You stopped, he said, wonderingly. Nobody stops. Ren went to the window and looked out at the clean, wet street, at Cedar Hollow going about its Saturday, a town that loved Silas Harrow, and she felt the size of the thing settle onto her. One beaten man that everyone had been trained to disbelieve. One starving dog with a number in her ear. A creek that kept its secrets, and a reservoir at the bottom of it that no one had ever thought to search. Because why would you, in a valley that trusted its best-loved son? She thought about how easy it would be, even now, to do the reasonable thing, to hand it all to somebody official, and drive on home to her empty house and let the machinery grind however it ground. And she knew she was not going to do that. And the knowing was not triumphant, it was quiet and a little frightening, like stepping off a bank into water you cannot see the bottom of. She turned back from the window. "We need proof," she said. "His word and my word won't be enough against a man like that. Not against the whole valley. We need the thing that can't be talked away." Mabel, arms folded in the doorway, said, "And how exactly do you plan to get that?" Ren looked down at the dog. Juno, who had gotten up onto 3 good legs and come to lean her whole weight against Ren's shins, trusting and warm and impossibly alive, and she felt the plan settle in her the way her plans always did, cold and clear. "He kept records," she said. "Eli said the animals disappear off the books, which means there are books. Men like Harrow always keep the books, because they can't help proving to themselves how clever they've been." She scratched the dog's good ear. "We find the books." Getting to the books meant getting close to Silas Harrow. And getting close to Silas Harrow, Mabel warned her, was not hard, because the man collected sympathetic strangers the way he collected donations. Ren drove out to the Harrow Refuge the next afternoon, in her mud-streaked Bronco, with a cover story she had built in an hour. A woman passing through, moved by the beautiful work she'd read about, wanting to volunteer, maybe to donate. And Silas Harrow met her in the gravel yard with both hands extended and a smile that reached all the way to his kind gray eyes. And Ren understood, in the first 10 seconds, exactly how a whole valley had been fooled. He was warm, he was funny. He remembered your name the instant he heard it, and used it like a small gift. He walked her through the clean front kennels, where the healthy adoptable animals lived in comfort, the photogenic ones, the ones that got their pictures in the paper, and he told the sad, true stories of where they'd come from, and his voice caught in exactly the right places. And Ren, who was good at reading people, could find no seam in it at all. That was the thing that frightened her most. There was no monster visible anywhere in the man. Just a good neighbor, doing good work, washing his hands at the little sink by the office door, a habit she noticed before and after he shook hers. But Ren had not survived 11 careful years by looking only where she was invited to look. While Silas fetched the donation paperwork, she memorized the layout, the outbuildings, the one long low shed at the back of the property, set apart from the others behind a chain-link gate with a real lock on it, the only lock on the place. And she noted the big quiet man called Dodd, who watched her from the equipment barn with red-knuckled hands hanging loose at his sides. And she noted that when a delivery truck came up the drive without a logo on its side, Silas's warm face closed for one instant like a shutter before it opened again. She signed the volunteer form with a false steadiness. She wrote a check, a real one, small enough not to matter, and large enough to buy her a reason to come back, and Silas held both her hands in both of his, and thanked her, and told her she had a good heart, and Ren smiled and thanked him and thought, "You drown the sick ones with a block and a cord." And something in her went very cold, and very quiet, and very sure. She came back 3 times over the next 10 days, always warm, always useful, mucking kennels and walking the adoptable dogs, making herself part of the furniture, and each time she learned a little more of the shape of the place and the rhythm of the man. End quote. She learned that Silas drove into town every Thursday for the Rotary lunch and was gone from noon to nearly 3. She learned that Dodd went with him because Silas did not like to drive. She learned that the long, low-log shed at the back had a smell coming off it under the bleach, that she recognized the smell of animals kept too close and fed too little, the smell that Juno had carried out of the creek. And she learned from a nervous young woman named Priya, who worked the front desk and flinched whenever Silas raised his voice even slightly, that the adoption records were kept on the office computer, but that Silas also kept, in the bottom drawer of his desk, locked a green cloth ledger that he wrote in by hand and let no one else touch. A ledger Priya had glimpsed once and been told in that gentle voice, that was worse than shouting, never to look at again. A ledger. Ren thought of what she had told Mabel. Men like Harrow always keep the books. And she began quietly to plan a Thursday. But she was not the only one making plans, and she had underestimated how quickly a smiling man could stop smiling. On her fourth visit, Silas met her in the yard again, and the warmth was still there, but there was something new underneath it, a watchfulness, and he asked her gently, oh so gently, where she was staying and how long she planned to be in the valley, and whether she'd been out to the old clinic to see poor Mabel Ochoa, because he'd heard, he said, that Mabel had taken in a stray off the mountain, and some poor confused man who'd been telling wild stories. And wasn't it a shame how some people needed to make themselves important with lies? He watched Ren's face while he said it, and Ren, who had spent 11 years learning to show nothing, showed nothing, and said she didn't know any doctor. Ochoa, she was just passing through, and Silas smiled and said, of course, and washed his hands at the little sink by the door. But she knew, driving home, that he had made her, or half made her, and that the clock she thought she was running had a second hand she hadn't seen. The first strike came that night. Ren was staying in a rented room above the hardware store in Cedar Hollow, and she woke a little after 2 to Juno standing rigid at the foot of the bed, a low sound coming out of the dog that Ren had never heard from her, and then the sound of a vehicle idling in the street below with its lights off. Ren went to the window in the dark and stood to the side of it the way she'd been taught long ago in a life she didn't talk about, and she watched a dark truck sit at the curb for a full 3 minutes, engine running, and then pull away slow, and she memorized what she could of it and did not sleep again. In the morning, the Bronco had 4 flat tires, each one cut clean with a blade, and tucked under the wiper was a single sheet of paper. No words on it, just a child's drawing of a dog and a wavy blue line that could only be a creek. And beneath the dog, the artist had drawn a small gray rectangle. A block. Ren stood in the cold morning with the paper in her hand, and Juno pressed against her leg. And she understood the message perfectly. We know what you saved. We can put it back, and... She should have been afraid, and some part of her was. But the larger part of her had crossed a line 10 days ago in a flooded ditch, and there was no going back over it. She went to Mabel's clinic with the drawing, and Mabel looked at it and set her jaw, and said it was time to bring in the law, and Ren agreed, though with no great hope, and that afternoon they drove out to see the county's game warden, a slow-moving, sad-eyed man named Deputy Aaron Fisk, who covered 400 square miles alone and had learned to want things proven before he moved on them. Fisk listened to the whole of it, to Eli's story, and the tag and the drowned dog and the cut tires and the drawing. And he rubbed his face with both hands and said what Ren had known he would say. I believe you, he said, which surprised her. But believing you and proving it are 2 different animals, and Silas Harrow has stood next to the state senator at 3 ribbon cuttings, and if I go out there on the word of a man he fired, and a drifter and Mabel Ocho, he will hand me my badge in a paper bag and thank me for my service. He leaned forward. Get me something real. Get me a record, a photograph, a body, and I will move heaven and earth. But I have to have the thing that can't be explained away. And Ren, who had been saying those same words to herself for 10 days, felt the last piece of the plan lock into place. Thursday, she thought. The green ledger. The bottom drawer. She went in on a Thursday, and it almost killed her. The plan was clean and simple, which was how she liked plans, because complicated plans broke. Silas and Dodd would leave at noon for the Rotary lunch. Priya, the nervous girl had agreed. After a long conversation, in which Ren had shown her the tag and the drawing and watched the last of the girl's disbelief drain out of her face, to leave the office door unlocked and take a long lunch of her own, so that she could truthfully say she'd seen nothing. Ren would have from 12:15 to no later than 2 to get into the office, get into the desk, photograph every page of the green ledger, and get out. Mabel would wait at the end of the drive in her car with the engine running, watching the road, and if Silas came back early she would call. They'd tested the one spot on the property with a signal, a rise near the mailbox, and Ren would go out the back. It was a good plan. It accounted for everything except the thing that no plan can account for, which is the past, waiting inside you, choosing its own moment to come back. She was in. The office was quiet and smelled of the bleach they used on the kennels, and under it, that other smell. The bottom drawer was locked, as Priya had said, but locks were another thing from the life Ren didn't talk about, and she had it open in 90 seconds, and there it was, the green cloth ledger, heavier than it looked, full of Silas Harrow's small, precise handwriting. She opened it on the desk and began to photograph, page by page. And what she saw made her hands go steady with rage. He had written it all down. Every animal, a line each, the sad rescue on one side, and the cold disposition on the other. And the code was not even much of a code. Sold, and a set of initials for the ones that went to the dog men, and for the others, a single letter, R, over and over. R, R. And Ren did not have to be told what R stood for because she had cut the cord off one of them in a flooded creek. Reservoir, he had counted them. 43 lines with an R beside them in 2 years. 43 living creatures he had wept over at fundraisers, and then waited and sunk. She photographed every page. And then turning toward the door with the ledger in her hands, she heard a sound from the back of the office, from the direction of the locked shed. A sound she had heard once before, in the worst hours of the life she didn't talk about, a metallic double click that some part of her body recognized before her mind did, and her mind went white, and she was not in the office anymore. She was somewhere else, a long way away, and a long time ago, in a hot, narrow place full of the same sound, with people she had been responsible for, and had not been able to save, and the ledger was gone from her hands, and she was on the floor of the Harrow Refuge office, with her back against the desk and her arms over her head, tearing gasps that would not fill her lungs, and she could not move. She could not move the way she had not been able to move then, and somewhere very far above her, the clock was eating the minutes she did not have. What brought her back was the dog. She had left Juno in the Bronco, but Juno, who had chewed through a window's worth of seal to follow the woman who had pulled her out of the water, was there now, having gotten in through the unlocked back door, and she came across the office and put her big gaunt body against Ren's, warm and solid and real. And she pressed her nose into the crook of Ren's neck and made a low sound, not a whine, something steadier, and Ren, from the bottom of the white place, felt it. She grabbed for the 3 true things, the way a drowning person grabs for the surface. The warm weight of the dog against her chest, the smell of bleach and old fur, and the dust of the office floor. And a voice not Mabel's this time but her own, thin and shaking but her own, saying, I've got you, I'm not going to leave you. The word she'd said in the creek, the word she'd needed to hear her whole life and had finally learned to say. And the white place let her go. She came back into her body on the floor of the office, with the dog in her arms, and the ledger fallen open beside her, and 40 seconds gone that felt like a year, and the metallic double click she realized had been nothing, a pipe cooling, the building settling, a sound from the empty, terrible room in her past, and not from this one at all. She got up. Her legs held. She picked up the ledger, and her phone buzzed once against her hip. Mabel's signal, and she went out the back with the dog at her heel, and the whole cruel accounting of Silas Harrow, photographed, and safe, 40 seconds late and alive. They almost made it clean. Ren was halfway down the backfield toward the fence line where she'd left a gap. Juno beside her, the ledger back in the drawer, exactly as she'd found it, and every page of it living now in the cloud, 100 miles from anyone Silas Harrow could reach, when she heard the truck in the drive too early, hours too early, and understood that the rotary lunch had been a trap of its own, or that Silas had simply grown tired of waiting, and that Mabel's warning call had come the same instant as the truck because Silas had not come up the drive at all but down the back lane, and there he was, stepping out of the passenger side with Dodd unfolding from the driver's seat. And Silas Harrow was smiling at her across the wet field with his kind gray eyes, and he said, in that gentle voice that was so much worse than shouting, "You must be cold out here. Come inside. Let's talk about what you think you found." She did not go inside. She stood her ground in the middle of the field with the dog against her leg, and Silas came toward her across the grass with his hands spread open and empty, still smiling, still gentle, and Dodd came wide around the other way, with the red-knuckled hands and no smile at all. And Silas said, "You're not from any charity, are you?" And Ren said nothing. And Silas nodded as if she'd confirmed something. "I looked you up," he said. "Ren Callaway. You lost people, didn't you? Overseas. That's why you stopped for that man on the road. That's your weakness, you know. You can't stand to drive past." He said it kindly, as though he were doing her a service by pointing it out. Most people learn. And Ren looked at this man who had turned mercy into bait, who had studied the best thing in her and named it a defect, and she felt the fear go out of her entirely and something else come in, something clear and cold as creek water. "It's not a weakness," she said. It was the first thing she'd said, and her voice came out even. "It's the only thing that ever made me worth anything." Dodd moved then, fast, for a big man, and Ren had half a second to decide who she was going to be. The life she didn't talk about had taught her a great many ways to put a man like Dodd on the ground, some of them for good, and for one white instant the old training reached up through her hands, and she felt exactly how easy it would be, how satisfying, how much this man deserved it. But Juno moved faster. The dog that had been starved and beaten and tied to a block by these two men came off Ren's leg like something released from a bowstring, and she hit Dodd low and hard. Not for herself, Ren understood in a flash of terrible clarity, but for Ren putting her own scarred body between the woman who had saved her and the men who had tried to drown her. And Dodd went down cursing under a snarling weight, and his boot came up and caught Juno in the ribs with a sound. Ren felt in her own chest, and the dog cried out and rolled and did not get up as fast, and something in Ren that had gone cold went hot again. She did not use the ways she'd been taught to break a man. That was the choice, and she made it in the space between one heartbeat and the next, with the dog hurt in the grass and Silas Harrow watching to see what she was, whether she was, in the end, just another kind of violence he could understand and manage. She was not. She got between Dodd and the dog, and when Dodd came up off the ground swinging, she did do only what she had to do, no more. She took the blow on her shoulder and put him down with the leverage that used his own weight and did not break anything of his that wouldn't heal, and she held him there face in the wet grass, breathing hard. And she looked up at Silas Harrow across the small distance and said, 43. He went still. "That's how many you wrote in the book," she said, with the R beside them. 43. And every one of them is at the bottom of your reservoir, and every one of them is photographed and out of your reach, and it is over. Silas's smile finally, at long last, went out, and for one instant she saw the thing that lived under it. And it was not a monster. It was worse. It was a man who had never once believed that the creatures he drowned were as real as himself. He reached slowly toward the small of his back, toward whatever was there, and Ren, holding Dodd down with the hurt dog behind her, thought, "So this is it. This is the moment." And she was not afraid. She did not have to find out what Silas Harrow was reaching for. because that was the moment Deputy Aaron Fisk's truck came over the rise at the end of the back lane, with its light bar going, and Mabel Ochoa's car right behind it, and Silas Harrow's hand came away from his back, empty, and rose into the air. Along with its twin, slow, and the smile came back onto his face, the man who coached the youth league, and he said, "Aaron, thank God, this woman is trespassing, and she assaulted my employee," and Ren watched him do it, watched him try to wash his hands one more time in front of the one man he thought he owned. But Aaron Fisk had spent 10 days doing the slow, tedious work that Ren had bought him, with those photographs sent from a diner an hour down the valley the moment she was clear of the field, and he had a warrant folded in his jacket that had taken a judge in the state capitol to sign, because no local judge would touch it. And he had 2 more county cars coming up the front drive. And he had, though Silas did not know it yet, a dive team scheduled for the reservoir at first light. "I know about the book," Silas Fisk said, and it was the saddest Ren had ever heard a man sound while doing the right thing. "I know about the reservoir. Put your hands on the truck." And the whole clean, bright edifice of Silas Harrow, the fundraisers, and the ribbon cuttings, and the puppy in the Christmas paper, came down in the wet field without a single raised voice. Exactly the way he had always done his worst work. It was not in the end spectacular, and Ren was glad of that, because she had learned a long time ago that spectacle is a lie the world tells about justice. There was no confession, no breakdown, no moment where Silas Harrow understood the enormity of what he'd done. There was, instead, a great deal of paper. There were the photographs of the ledger, 43 lines, authenticated and entered into evidence. There was the dive team that went into the cold green reservoir at first light and came up, over 3 terrible days, with enough to make even Deputy Fisk stop eating for a while. Small weighted bundles that the whole valley had never once imagined were down there under the water they drank. There was Priya, the nervous girl, who found her courage in the end and testified to the ledger she'd been forbidden to look at. And there was Eli Brandt, alive because a woman had stopped on a mountain road, who told the courtroom in his cracked, recovering voice everything he had seen. And there was the slow, tedious, incomplete machinery of the law, grinding for the better part of a year, that Ren attended every day she could, because she had learned that this too was a kind of rescue, the unglamorous kind, the kind that saved no one who could still be saved, but told the truth about the ones who couldn't, and made it so. It could never be washed away. Silas Harrow went to prison, though not for as long as 43 lives should have cost him, because the law counts animals differently than Ren's heart did, and Dodd went with him for less, and the Harrow Refuge was shut, and its remaining animals scattered to real sanctuaries 3 counties wide. And the town that had loved Silas Harrow did the thing that towns do, which was to be quietly, deeply ashamed, and to look away from the shame, and to slowly rebuild its sense of itself around a new story, in which they had always half suspected, in which the drifter woman and old Mabel Ochoa and the fired security man had been the ones who saw clearly. Ren did not much care what story the valley told. She had gotten what she came for, which was the thing that could not be explained away, the truth pulled up out of the cold water into the light where everyone had to see it. And she had done, without ever meaning to, a great many things she had not come for at all, because here is what happened while the paper ground its slow way through the courts. Ren Callaway did not drive home to her empty house. She meant to, more than once. She would stand in the room over the hardware store, with her bag half packed, and tell herself the job was done, and she could go back to the long roads, and the white line, and the safe cold arithmetic of a life with nothing waiting in it. And then Mabel would call about a fundraiser for the new clinic wing, or Eli would need a ride to physical therapy because his hands still shook. Or Priya would show up at the door, white-faced, because she'd gotten a letter from Silas's lawyer and didn't know what to do. And Ren would stay one more day, and one more. And somewhere in all those one more days, the empty house stopped being home, and the crowded valley started being it, and she did not notice the exact moment it happened, which is, she came to believe, the only way that particular thing ever happens. And there was the dog. Juno's ribs healed and her leg healed, though she would always carry a stiffness in it in cold weather, and the gaunt washboard body filled out into something glossy and strong, and the terror went out of her by slow degrees and was replaced by a settled, watchful devotion that fixed itself entirely and permanently on Ren. She slept at the foot of Ren's bed and rode in the passenger seat of the reshod Bronco, and knew before Ren did when the white place from the past was coming, and would be there with her warm weight and her steady nose in the crook of the neck before the worst of it landed. So that the flashbacks that had ruled Ren for 11 years grew shorter and rarer, and less able to take her because she was no longer facing them alone. Ren had gone down a bank in a storm to save a life, and had been saved in return, and she understood at last, holding the dog on a quiet evening a year on, that this was the whole shape of it. This was the thing the man had whispered from his gray lips in the ditch that had turned out to be true in a way he never meant. He's still breathing. So was she. For the first time in a long time, so was she. They found the last of the ones from the ledger in the reservoir that autumn, and Ren and Mabel and Eli and Priya and Deputy Fisk stood together on the shore in a cold wind, while a young minister named Reverend Okafor, who ran the little church whose new roof Silas had bought with blood money, said a few plain words over the water for 43 creatures that no one had ever grieved. It was Ren's idea to market. She had come into some money by then, a modest inheritance from an aunt she'd barely known. The kind of tidy legal windfall that arrives out of nowhere and asks what you'll make of it. And she made of it a thing she could not have imagined a year before. She founded a small sanctuary of her own on land above the reservoir, and she named it not for herself and not for any grand idea, but simply the Stillwater Refuge, because Stillwater was where the cruelty had hidden and where the truth had finally been found, and she meant to make the name mean something better. Mabel ran the medical side. Eli, whose hands grew steadier as the work gave him a reason to use them, built the kennels and mended the fences. Priya kept the books, open books, that anyone could look at any time, and often invited them to. And Ren ran the whole thing with the same cold, clear competence she'd once used to keep the world at arm's length, except that now she used it to pull the world in close. She never took a romantic partner, and the valley, which liked to pair people off, eventually stopped expecting her to. What she took instead was a family, the assembled and unlikely kind. The kind that gathers around a wood stove on a winter night and argues about nothing and stays too late. Mabel became the older sister she'd never had. Eli, the man she'd pulled from the creek, became something like a brother. The two of them bound by a night neither could ever fully explain to anyone who hadn't been there. Priya, who had been so frightened, grew into a fierce and funny young woman who called Ren at all hours and treated her opinions as law and rejected half of them on principle. And Deputy Fisk, sad-eyed and slow, took to stopping by on his long rounds, and Ren always had the coffee on, and it was still bad coffee, and it became a running joke between them that a woman who could plan a break-in to the minute could not, apparently, be trusted with a coffee maker. Juno had opinions about all of them, and made them known, and lay in the middle of the warm room like a queen among her subjects. And when Ren looked around on those nights, she could not find the woman who had once driven the long roads alone and called it safety. The rescued animals came and went, because that was the point of the place. That was the whole hard grace of it. Ren learned the lesson the sanctuary taught over and over, the lesson she'd first felt in a flooded creek, with a dog's rough tongue on her salt cheek, which was that you do not get a vote in the ending. You pull the living thing out of the dark and you warm it, and you heal what can be healed, and then you open your hands and you let it go back into its own life, into the world, or the wild, or another family's living room, and you do not get to keep it, and you do not get to know how the story finishes. And the letting go is not the failure of the rescue, but its entire purpose. She got good at it mostly. She stood at the gate and watched 100 healed creatures leave for lives she would never see, and she learned to feel the ache of it as something clean, the ache of a door held open rather than a door slammed shut. Only Juno stayed, because Juno had chosen her in the creek and would not be unchosen, and Ren had stopped pretending she wanted it any other way. Ale asked her once, on one of the woodstove nights, why she thought she'd stop that night on the mountain when she told him, and told everyone, that she spent 11 years making a religion out of not stopping. Ren was quiet a long time, the way she got, and Juno lifted her head to watch her. And finally Ren said the truest thing she knew, which was that she didn't think she had stopped at all. Not really. "I think," she said, "I've been driving past the same ditch for 11 years. My own. And that night I just for once I looked down into it instead of past it. And there was somebody down there, and it turned out to be me. Nobody said anything for a while after that. Mabel got up and put another log in the stove. And that was the closest Ren ever came to explaining it. And it was enough. And they let it be. If you have listened this far, then there is something I want to say to you directly. Because this was never only a story about a woman and a dog and a smiling man who did unspeakable things behind a wall of everyone's trust. It was about the ditch you drive past. You have one. Everyone does. There is some dark, low place beside the road of your life that you have trained yourself not to look into. Some grief you have called safety. Some door you have mortared shut and told yourself the shutting was wisdom. And you have gotten very good, maybe, at keeping your hands on the wheel and your eyes on the white line, and telling yourself that the shapes in the dark are traps or corpses or someone else's disaster that will become your own if you let it. Sometimes that is even true. But here is the thing the whole long night on the mountain was trying to say. Mercy does not erase your grief. It will not empty the ditch or bring back the ones you lost or make the cold arithmetic come out, even. What it does is stranger and better than that. It reorders the grief. It takes the same freight you have been carrying alone, and it makes of it a reason. And it puts something warm and breathing at the foot of your bed to wake you before the worst of the dark can take you. And grace, real grace, does not arrive the way you picture it. Clean and glorious and convenient. It arrives soaked and starving and half drowned, tied to a weight, snapping at the hand that reaches for it. At 2 in the morning in the middle of a storm, when every reasonable voice you own is telling you to keep driving. It arrives as an interruption. It arrives as the very thing you swore you would never do. And the terrible, wonderful secret is that you cannot tell, in the moment you stop, whether you are the rescuer or the rescued. And it does not matter, because in the only rescues that ever truly count, it is always, always both. The man in the ditch whispered he's still breathing, and he meant the dog, and he was right. But he was saying it, though he never knew it, to a woman who had not felt herself breathe in 11 years, and he was right about her too. So, when you come to your ditch, and you will, on some black road in some storm, you did not see coming, and there is a shape down there in the water that it would be so much safer to drive past, I hope you remember Ren Callaway, who was not brave and was not whole and had every good reason to keep going, and who touched the brake anyway, and slid down the bank into the cold, and put her arms around the drowning thing, and said the words she had needed her whole life to hear. "I've got you. I'm not going to leave you." I hope you say them to whatever you find down there. And I hope, when you do, you understand at last that the whisper you have been listening for in the dark, the one that says the impossible thing, the one that says it isn't over, there is still something here worth saving. It's still breathing. I hope you understand that it was your own voice all along, and that the only thing it was ever waiting for was for you to stop.